Okay, carrying on with part 2 of this video now, and just starting to color in the base layers of the brown eye. Just starting with this nice warm, really it's like a tan color, has a slight orange hue to it, and we're just adding that very bottom layer of what will be the brown eye for this pet. And you can see in the upper right section of that eye, I'm not coloring it in. That's where the highlight of the light source was hitting it. If you look over to the left, I have the finished pet portrait, and you can see that white that adds a lot more realism and gives that sense of a bright shine to a very smooth surface like an eye. And now just starting to add in some darker color, accentuating where the eyelid meets the eye. And just being sure to use very gentle pressure on all of these layers, because we're going to be adding more layers and we'll be adding further depth of color. And just very lightly going in to where the iris and the pupil area will be. And this is very light pressure still. It's just enough to where the pencil tip is touching and you can see the color coming in, but you're not applying a lot of pressure because there's still going to be more layers and more solvent to be putting on this. And part of the many layers, we're going to bring orange into the eye. This is going over that medium tan color that we had. We're going to still be layering more colors on top of this, so the eye won't appear orange, but it's going to be another color that's going to have a translucency that you're going to see the depth of the eye, the dimension of colors, that it's not just one color that we're seeing. And this gives a lot of realism to a pet's features, or any wildlife or human portraits. You really want the eyes, if there's a focus there and you can see the depth of color, you want to really make sure you are accentuating that. And bringing in another color now, and just gently light pressure going over this part of the eye again. And I'm just going to establish a few of the lighter areas. This isn't going to change the color, it's just accentuating a little bit of where some of the light will be, lighter areas of the pet's eye. And then we'll be coming in with a darker color over that. into a darker brown. Okay, and now we're going to bring in a darker brown to add another layer and increase the depth of the iris as well as the pupil. So in the eye section, I had applied a little bit of the odorless mineral spirits, and while that's drying, I'm adding the base color to this pet's fur. This is just a warm, light cream color, and it's going to help establish a base so we can put darker fur over the top of it. And keeping those pencil strokes in the direction that the pet's fur grows in, and we're going to continue to do that with each layer that we add on. And now bringing in some light gray to those sections of the lighter fur. And just beginning to add a little bit more into the shaded area of the costume, adding this medium gray tone, and we're just going to lightly build those layers up as the folds of the costume determine where the light and the shadow are appearing. And just very light pressure, and using a couple of different directions here because this is not fur, it's more of a felt, soft fabric, and you want to just evenly and make this look as soft as it is, so it gives a good sense of the texture and how that differs from the pet's fur. And we're starting to put in this orange color for the costume, just lightly adding that in now. This is just one of many layers that we'll be putting in. And just need to remove a little bit of these pencil marks. Again, just applying pressure and pulling away will tend to pull those areas of graphite that were indicating where some of these sections of the costume had folds and little bends in them. Now we're going to introduce a darker orange into this costume, adding a little more depth to the color that we have in this fold. I'm now starting to darken in the bridge of the nose, and as the fur has a slightly different color here, as well as some of the skin showing from underneath, this area needs a little bit more particular attention. It helps give a sense of the direction and in this portrait where the pet is positioned. So paying close attention to this and making sure you're looking at your reference photo. That's really vital. Don't assume where these lines and marks are. If you're trying to capture a pet as closely as possible in the portraiture, then be sure to look at the photograph reference, because that's going to really guide you the best way rather than just trying to guesstimate where some of these marks are. And this is just another layer. There will be more layers over this, so you don't fully darken one section in. You just gradually add those areas of the darker fur. And bringing in some darker gray areas. This is going to be for the area on the cheek where not only do the shadows, but this helps give a sense of structure, where the musculature is in the part of the cheek, and also where some of the more shaded areas will be. And now I'm beginning to establish the marks of the pet's nose. This is a little bit of a unique situation. The pet portrait that I was commissioned to work on, the actual picture of the pet, it had a very dry nose, and there was a little bit of cracking and scaling on the nose, as you'll see this develop further. But just before completion and sending that my progress at that point to the client, they wanted me to modify the nose from the original photograph they had provided. Since that wasn't communicated in the beginning, I was duplicating exactly the nose that I was looking at. So you'll see this develop with many lighter areas as we progress through this, and that indicates some of the dryness and the cracking that was happening on the skin of the nose. But since they indicated afterwards that that was not fully representative of the way that pet appeared, it was only during that photograph, they wanted me to try to bring it back to more of a fully complete dark nose, which you see in the left-hand corner of the screen in the final pet portrait. I did go over the nose and worked it more to the satisfaction of the client, where they agreed that that looked more like the nose that would more often represented their pet, even though it wasn't in the photograph they provided. So when you're doing a commission, just make sure you have really clear communication, and if anything needs to be modified, try to establish that as early as possible, since the color pencils can be modified, but it's a little bit more difficult when you've when you've added multiple layers to your portrait. So communication is always great, and it's, I did it early enough, a few times when the nose was being established, with communicating with the client, just to make sure they were happy with the progress to that point, and that's where that modification needed to be added, as well as darkening the fur overall, which has a lot to do with how our monitors can look at a portrait, and it also has to do with the photo quality. Maybe the exposure was a little bit higher, and that's what you'll develop as an artist. You'll duplicate what you're seeing, but only the pet owner knows exactly the nuances of the fur color, and they can help us establish more accurately what needs to be added in. So the pet portrait did become darker, as you can see in the final portrait I completed over on the left in the smaller square box. But this was all, part of the process of layering this together and putting it down, not rushing to anything. And the client in the end was extremely happy with the portrait, and it was a gift for his children, and they were very appreciative of the portrait and how their pet was perceived, and it was really a fun project to do. All pets are a lot of fun, but I love the whimsical piece of this where they had the costume and they happened to get a great photo of their pet, and I loved working on that part of the Tigger costume. It was, you don't get to use bright orange colors like that often, and this was a lot of fun. And just coming in on top of that nose with these darker colors, lots of little circles of very light pressure. A pet's nose, a dog's nose, you'll notice there are a lot of subtleties in it, the way the light hits. It's not just a black or a brown nose. When you really look at a pet's nose close up, you'll see a lot of details and nuances depending on the shape and the lighting. And this probably would have had a more even coloring at this point. I probably would have gone over the whole nose very lightly with this pencil, but because of the dryness and the cracking of the nose, the colors were anywhere between like a medium cream, light brown, towards areas of the darker nose, very dark brown, almost black. So just very lightly adding in as I was looking at my reference and adding the parts in that appeared darker in the reference photo. And now that I've got a good amount of layers and built up colors here, I'm going to start adding the odorless mineral spirits, and just very lightly with a very small amount on the tip of the brush, just starting to paint that in. And you can really see with the mineral spirits being applied, the smoothness that's beginning to happen, and it just melts that pigment into the paper without damaging the tooth of the paper. As long as you give this plenty of time to dry, it'll really enhance your color pencil artwork. And now just bringing in that orange color, coloring in that part of the costume where there's going to be a lot of folds and bends. Light and shadow will be hitting the orange, so we're just starting to get a baseline here and following those guidelines that we created prior to adding the colored pencil. So we know where those folds will be, and it's just taking one step at a time, a lot of layers, the many different colors of orange that we're going to use. You'll notice in the folds on the fabric over on the left completed portrait how that adding a color like this to a pet portrait can really bring light and more realism. You wouldn't expect that with an orange cape, but if you look over at the finished completed portrait, that those areas where the light was hitting the costume give it more of a sense of softness and depth and dimension. I'm just taking off a little bit of those reference lines with the kneaded eraser. Many layers of color. We're going to add a darker orange onto this section and establishing that shaded area. Just slowly keep working in light layers and you'll get a much better finished product. And in these darker, more recessed areas of this fabric, it's not just the dark orange. We're going to introduce colors outside of that range. So adding some dark gray will be a nice addition to help establish the shaded area. And again, just very light pressure here, and we're not going to go too drastic. We're just going to add this in and we'll keep building layers, and we'll also be using the mineral spirits as we get a little further, a little bit more down here on the pencil layers, and no need to rush. Just very slowly and gently work on the building these layers of fabric and the layers of color that our eyes end up seeing. And now that we've got several layers down, we're going to start adding some odorless mineral spirits, and you're really going to see the areas that we're painting over really darken and really blend in, just dissolving those colors right into the paper. And now that the nose section is fully dried from the odorless mineral spirits, I'm going in to add some cool light gray color, and this was to establish the different areas of the pet's nose that were the result of the cracking and the dryness. But you'll see that develop, and there was a lot of color and texture to create this. And just coming in now with a very dark pencil. This is a very dark brown, nearly black, just to accentuate some of those dark areas on the nose, the nostrils, where there was so much shading to do in there, and we're just adding these layers back on. The previous layers have already been solidified with the odorless mineral spirits, and now it's a great surface to work on again since it's fully dried. And we're just going to add all these dark areas in, creating more layers and accentuating more depth and realism to the pet's nose. And now just going to start establishing in some of the darker areas where the dryness of the nose was showing through, and there are many dark and light areas here, and that's how the different dryness and some of the scaling was indicated because of those light and dark areas, and some of the cracking that can happen on a pet's nose when their noses get too dry. And now that we've got a lot of these markings and areas established, we're going to come back in again for more odorless mineral spirits, and you'll see it dissolving the pigments right back into the paper and adding more of a smoothness, more of a complete finished look as we keep going. There's still more layers to add on, but this is once again something that we're going to add here, and then we're going to let this fully dry. So I've let that fully dry overnight, and now that it's workable again, we're going to come back in and add more colors and more layers to continue to build up the structure and the color base of this pet's nose, and just gently still adding in these layers. The paper still has a tooth to it, so it's still accepting more color, and we're not pressing down hard here at all. Bringing in this darker gray now, just lightly adding in some of the shaded areas around the nose and adding that fur that's darker outside of the nose and near the lower lip. And we're going to keep just building these up very lightly and very slowly, one layer at a time. It really does make a difference as you're creating pet portraits or any colored pencil artwork. If you want it to look realistic, just be patient and work very slowly, and the end result will be something you or a client or someone who is interested in your artwork will really be able to enjoy all the subtleties and the detail that you've added in. And that can only be done in this type of realistic pet portrait by going slowly and adding those layers, just building them a little at a time. And now we'll bring in the light gray and just slowly go over some of these highlighted areas, just adding that next layer of depth and just gently going over these lighter areas. Adding a darker color now for those lips and establishing any of the other dark areas around the mouth and the nose that might need a little bit more color added and a little bit more darkness added than the other areas will. You'll see around the nose in this pet that there's a lot of areas of dark color for the lips that need to get established before we can get too much further. And coming back in with those odorless mineral spirits, we'll use a lot of those as the layers keep building, but that's how we get a smoothness and how we can keep adding on more layers and really get depth and dimension, really giving it more of a painterly look through this process, and it's all well worth it. And you can really see how this enhances the colors that you've laid down and really spreads that color deeper into the paper and just really starts bringing it to life. And now adding more of the orange for this fabric and this Tigger costume, really just lightly layering the pencil in, and we're just basically painting this slowly and a little at a time, but you're going to see this fabric really start to take shape and come to life as we add more color and really establish where the light and the shadow are. That's really going to give more realism to this piece. Now we'll bring in a darker orange to start accentuating the color under the neck, which is going to be one of the darker areas along with the folds in the fabric. And just gradually entering that in and being sure not to go towards where the fur is. You have to almost work in negative spaces here, establishing that the fur is going to be in the foreground of this costume, up where the chin and the neck meet. So we're being careful in that area, because if you get the orange in it, it's going to be nearly impossible to remove before adding more realism to that light fur that's going to be tufted out next to the fabric. And now we're going to bring in a little bit of that gray color to further enhance the shadow area on this costume of Tigger, and just very light pressure. We don't want to influence this too much into a straight ahead gray tone, but we're just building that layer and working that fur in up at the top where the fur will be sticking out from the shaded area of the cape. Any of the recessed areas or the shadow of the cape will have just a little bit of this medium to dark gray color added into it. And again, these are Caran Luminance pencils. They are light fast, and if you're not familiar with the term light fast, it basically means the amount of color you see going on, as bright as it might be, will stand the test of time. It's going to hold that color for a long time. These are slightly more expensive pencils, but when you buy the inexpensive ones, they're not light fast. Most of them won't be light fast, and those will fade much quicker and more easily. Even with just a little bit of sunlight near them, they can lose their color over maybe a year or two. These, over several years, will retain their full spectrum of color. And just continuing to build those layers, adding more orange into this cape section. And then we're going to have enough layers that we can start adding some of the odorless mineral spirits very soon here. And you're going to see that color start to blend in, and we'll continue back with many more layers. So this is still building that base of color that we need to really get a realistic look of fabric. And now we're going to start painting in those odorless mineral spirits, working in the light areas first here, and then we'll be moving over into the darker areas. This will be where the highlighted areas of the cape are. And just continuing to basically paint over the colored pencil layers that we had put down. And you could already see it really smoothing out and enhancing the color in these areas. This is a very relaxing process. If you have the patience to create colored pencil portraits and you work upon layers, multiple layers, and then you get to this point where you're adding the brush and seeing that pigment dissolve in, getting that really smooth and warm effect, it's really enjoyable. And now I'm going to work on the nose section again. Since it's fully dried from the last time we worked on it with the odorless mineral spirits, we can go over it again and just lightly add some more color to this area. We're going to bring in some of the darks and accentuate those sections around the mouth and on the nose that need some more layers of dark put into them. And now we're going to bring in the light yellow pencil, not only creating an underpainting, but this is going to come through on those highlights that we will continue to build upon. The light was hitting the outer edges of this part of the cape, and you'll see the areas on the folds as the light and the dark hits them. So one orange cape, but not just one orange color. Many, many colors make up materials, make up skin tones, eye color, fur. There's a lot of textures, and when we work in drawings and artwork, there's combinations of, do we have the shape and the perspective of the subject that we're creating? Do we have the right values of light and dark? Are the tones right in the color? Are the hues correctly adjusted? And we do this just very gradually and very slowly, and one step at a time, and just take your time with this. Adding some more highlights now into the nose. Just remembering that the nose reference I was working from was a cracked and dry nose, and that's the textures and the colors that we're simulating here. Later this was turned more into closer to a standard a dark gray color, black color that we see in a dog's nose, and that was corrected later on per the client's request. But here we're creating a lot of textures and taking a lot of care to make sure that we duplicate what I saw in the photograph. And now we're going to continue on with the cape, building those layers again and adding this yellow to get a good underlying base layer. And now bringing the orange color over that yellow. Being careful not to go over too heavily the areas that will be the highlighted sections, but concentrate a little bit more on the shaded areas, as we'll keep building those a little bit darker with more layers as we go through. So we work from light to dark in colored pencils. That's the best way to lay these colors down. If you add dark colors, if we made this a darker orange and then wanted to add light highlights of the yellow, it really wouldn't show up very well. It would pretty much look translucent over the layers underneath. So in colored pencils we work differently. If you're familiar with watercolor, it's similar in that light layers don't go well on top of the dark layers. Now oil paints, acrylics, pastels, those are different. You can lay out dark colors first, But as we're doing a colored pencil piece here, we want to focus on the process of which sections to put down first. So we'll focus on what I've found to work the best, and that gives me a more realistic pet portrait or any type of artwork. If it's a still life, just working on these layers and beginning with the light layers and working towards the darker layers as we build upon the previous layers that we've established. And now just working in some odorless mineral spirits and refining some of the areas that we had laid down earlier. Just making some fine-tune adjustments, adding a little bit more colored pencil, and then going over that with the mineral spirits. It's also continuing to blend as you see some of the lighter and darker colors of orange. They are becoming more realistic in that they're not just one color in one section. It's a complete mix of colors. And we're continuing to add more layers and more color to the cape. And it's just one layer at a time, light pressure, and continuing with the same. And this darker orange is going to go into the areas where there's going to be more shading. So the tones and the hue are going to change a little bit in here. And we'll continue to add more colors. It won't just be this darker orange color. We'll add some grays, maybe even a little bit of purple, maybe even some different tones of brown in there. And then at the bottom of the cape, it's going to fade out. So it's not going to cut off at one point as we approach the edge of the paper. And here we're continuing to establish that darker area, the shading areas of the cape. And we'll keep building these layers up. And you're starting to see now as the darker areas come in, it's helping to accentuate the areas that we've kept with more of just the yellows and the creams. But we'll add more layers on that as well. And another layer here. The odorless mineral spirits we applied the other day have fully dried, so we can start building these layers up a little more fully, get a little bit more brightness and depth and dimension to this part of the costume. And now more light tones, bringing the yellow back in and adding another layer onto this ripple of the Tigger fabric of the costume. And we're going to add more of this and maybe some cream colors, and we'll keep building those layers until they blend perfectly with the shaded layers. But these are the part of the costume that we're being exposed more to a light source. So we want the edges here to be really standing out. And this makes a good base color for the darker orange and the shaded area that we need as well. And now enhancing those shaded areas a little bit further, adding in another layer. And we'll keep blending and keep working these until we get just the right depth and shadow that we need. And here we're going to start introducing some of the brown into the shaded area, giving this a nice crisp break from that light edge that's just to the left of it. And continuing on with the orange pencil, just adding this layer and continuing to build these layers of the costume before adding some more odorless mineral spirits, which will really enhance these colors and bring a little bit more realism to this piece. And here we are adding more mineral spirits. This really does bring a lot of life and dimension to this piece, and this is really a very satisfying thing to be doing, to add these spirits, and it really kind of melts that pigment right into the paper. And letting that dry overnight, working on this again, building up more layers, just continuing this process until we get the desired effect. There's no rushing these pieces. If you want them to look more realistic, they're going to need a lot of layers and it's going to take time to build them up, but it's really worth the while and worth the wait. And now just bringing more layers of color into the pet's face. And we're just going to keep building these layers as well. Very short fur means very short pencil strokes. You don't want to go too far with these. This is where the very small hairs of this breed are, and we're going to keep mimicking that as we go. And you can see how we're now bringing a little bit more dark pencil color into the shading underneath the neck. And we're going to add a lot of layers here because the fur gets a little bit longer and was really exposed to a lot less light. So this was a darker area, and we're going to keep building that up. You want your values to be very light where they need to be light and very dark where they need to be very dark. Generally, don't be afraid to go too dark into the pieces, because I think we all tend to want to keep the pictures lighter, especially as we're starting out. It's just a fear of going too far with something and adding too much color and feeling that we can't reverse it. But generally, you could go a little bit darker than you probably think, and just compare your original piece to the photograph, or if you're working from a still life, really look at the values of the light and the dark. And you see how we just keep putting more marks and more lines for that fur, focusing mostly here on the lower part of the neck where the shadow is, but recognizing where the light will be. And we'll just continue adding these marks in and making sure that we have enough shading. And just going to keep enhancing more of the light and the shadow in here as we get towards the end of this piece. And even this light part of the muzzle that seems that it might be very light, we're still adding color into that just a bit. We are working on white paper, and we want this to stand out from the white. And continuing to darken this section a little bit on the top of the head, and as we come down towards the nose. And adding a little bit more darker pencil here as we keep going and redefining and enhancing the areas of the light and the dark. And all those variations in the pet's fur. as this is just nearing completion now, this was a really fun piece to do, and I did end up changing the nose out a bit, as you can see in the upper left-hand corner is the finished pet portrait, and that was per the pet owner's request, and we wanted to make sure that they got just the pet portrait that they wanted, and they were very happy with how the nose turned out in the final version. And we darkened the fur just a little bit further from what you can see on the video here. And working on that Tigger costume fabric, that was a lot of fun. It was really fun blending something that is more plush and man-made and adding that to the pet. And you can really see how those two styles really, they're a lot different from each other. We've got the fabric, and that has a look of its own, and we've got the fur, which has a completely different look. Much more gentle and muted colors on the fur, and it's much more stark on the costume. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial, and I'll have a lot more coming along. And let me know if there's anything you'd like me to cover, and what you enjoy seeing and would like to see further. Thanks again for watching, everyone. Here's the final piece.